Now that we have validation annotations in place on our model, let's go into the controller, the event controller, and see how we can enforce those validation parameters or criteria when we're creating a new event. So I'm going to go down to the middle of my class here where I have this post handler, process create event form. Recall this is the method that gets called when we post from that form, and we use model binding using the @model attribute so that the incoming data is automatically shoved into an event object, and then we just have to add that event object to our data layer. So this is the point at which I want to make sure that I'm not adding something that has invalid data. So we said that both the model and the controller are responsible for data validation. The model's part is to define what the validation parameters are. It's supposed to say, this is what good data looks like. The controller is going to be responsible for checking those criteria. And with Spring Boot, there's a relatively straightforward way to enforce those validation annotations. And so when I'm using model binding, I go into the method signature here, and right in front of this event object, which will be bound, I can add the @valid annotation. And so this annotation says that not only should Spring Boot do model binding when it comes in, but it should check any validation annotations that are on the fields for this class and make sure that they're satisfied. All right, so let's go ahead and start out the application and see what behavior happens now that we have this @valid. Recall that last time, even though we had validation annotations on our class, we were able to go into the form and submit the form with empty fields, and it was fine creating a class here, or an object here. Okay, so I'm going to go to my application in the browser now, localhost 8080, click on create event, and now let's try to create an event with empty fields. Okay, and so we see we got an error message here. And as always, Java stack traces are a little bit gnarly to read, but if you look here below this error, which says validation.bind exception, we see field error at object event on field name. So it's talking about the name field of the event object, and it's saying that it rejected the value, and there's some braces there which make it look like there was an empty value, which is what we would expect. And it's saying that the reason why that was rejected was that the name must be between 3 and 50 characters. So this is our message, our validation message that we put on that annotation. All right, and so it also rejected the not blank validation annotation as well. So this failed, and we only see that while we know ourselves that all 3 fields failed. Once it failed the first one, it stopped right there and threw an error. So this is one step forward. Our application is now checking the data within incoming form submissions. However, this display message is not very good. We don't want to show this to a user. So let's go back to IntelliJ. I'm going to stop my application, and I'm going to introduce a new object that will allow us to check for errors in the controller. So in my controller signature, I can add a new parameter, and it's called errors, and we'll give it the name errors. Okay, so this errors object will be populated by any validation errors that occur when Spring Boot does validation on the object, corresponding to the validation annotations that we've set up. So all I have to do within my controller is to check to see whether or not there are any validation errors. So let me go in here and let me put a condition. I'll say if errors.hasErrors. So this is a Boolean method. It will return true or false based on whether or not there were any validation errors. If there are errors, I don't want to try to add the event. I just want to short circuit. And what I probably want to do is to go back to the form. So let's go back to the event create form. So I'm going to copy and paste the code from above that does that for us. And I need a model object to do that as well, since I'm setting the title. So I'll add that to my method signature. Okay, so now if there are any errors in this errors object, we will, instead of creating the object, we'll just go back to the form. Now we're not going to be displaying a message here. That will happen a little bit later, but yeah, this should do the trick for us. Let's go ahead and start it up and see how that works. Okay, the application is now running. Let me go back to the browser, and I'll load my form. And now, if I hit create, instead of getting a 400 page, I just get sent back here. So this is not great. The user might do this and say, well, why did you just send me back to the same form? So let's add a little simple error message. If we, let's say that if we have an error, so if we're in this conditional, let's add a new model attribute. We'll call it error MSG for message. And we'll just say bad data. We don't really have a good way right now of, I haven't introduced to you a good way of determining what the errors were, so we'll just report something simplistic like this. Now let's go into the template and see what we can do. So we need to go into the create template, since that's where we'll be sending them back to. So I'll go in here, and at the top, just above the form, let me put p th colon text equals, and I'll say error message. And maybe let me give that a style. So I'll say style equals color red. Okay, so now this paragraph tag will be populated by the value of this error message parameter, and if it exists. All right, so let's restart our application. And hopefully we'll get a slightly more user-friendly result this time. Okay, the app started up. Well, oops, let me refresh. And now I'll hit the create button. And now I have an error message. Now this error message is not very useful. We'll work on improving that in the next video. For now, though, this is definitely a step forward. Let's try out some different properties or some different values for our properties here in the form and see what happens. So for name, I know it needs to be between 3 and 5. So let me submit something with, 3 and 20. Let me submit something with 2 characters. And we did see that that failed. Let me submit something with 3 characters. And that indeed passed. Although you might wonder why that passed. So the description we said could be empty. So that's fine, but that email validation should have failed. I didn't enter an email. And notice that in my event class, I did say that this email, contact email field has to be a valid email. And the reason why that this didn't fail is that a blank email is still going to pass this. So I need to go in and add another annotation here and say not blank. Okay, so now I'll restart again. And now if I try to do the same thing, submitting an event with a valid name and description but no email, I should get yelled at. Okay, so we'll go to create an event and we'll try to do the exact same thing again. A name with 3 characters and no email. And now it did flag that because I said that the email could not be blank. So let's just try this again. And I will say, okay. And so now I submitted valid form data. I have a name that's at the proper length, no description, which is fine, and a valid email. Let's maybe try one more use case, which is just to do the same thing but with an invalid email. All right, so we see using just a string of characters without email formatting also fails validation. So now we've actually enabled validation in the controller. So these annotations on our model class are being used to ensure that the data that's coming in is properly formatted. And if it's not properly formatted, we use a conditional over here in our controller. There we go. We use a conditional to check for errors, and if there are errors, then we send the user back to the form with an error message. In the next video, we'll look at how we can make those error messages more accurate. In particular, how we can use the message attributes that we've added to our annotations and display those to the user directly where the errors occur, which is a much more user-friendly outcome.